This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
By its very nature, even the very terms of the phrase itself, the period eye is synecdochic. In its Latin roots, synecdoche suggests the familiar literary definition of part for the whole or whole for the part. And from its Greek roots, it evokes a receiving together of things. For instance, a simultaneity of getting gifts, or less tangibly, of making observations. The period eye, both implicitly and explicitly, is a part standing in for the whole and indicates a simultaneity of perception. For in his Painting and Experience in 15th century Italy of 1972, Baxandall posited a single eye with a single glance. One eye stood in for the two by which individuals learned about the world, and a lone look stood in for the multiple glances by which individuals perceive the details of an object, possibly first running their eyes across its surface for a general idea about shape and size, and then observing more closely variations in shading. There was also the suggestion of simultaneity, since Baxandall compressed the sequence of glances into a single moment with his assumption of one look. The mental interpretation that followed this visual observation, Baxandall claimed, was likewise simultaneous. It too was reminiscent of the Greek synecdoche. Across numerous pages of Painting and Experience in 15th century Italy, he described the associations that a painting could evoke for a 15th century viewer. But he warned his reader that his sequential argument was merely a rhetorical device. Mental associations occurred at the same time in the human mind. There was one instance where Baxandall acknowledged sequence, the transporting of observations by the eye to the mind, a process that required the passage of time. This instance, however, appears only in Baxandall's opening paragraph, and then fades from the reader's mind, overwhelmed by the detailed description of the simultaneous mental associations. The synecdochic base to Baxandall's argument inevitably opens it up to critique for a loss of historical particularity, as scholars from Ernst Gombrich to more recently Adrian Randolph have noted. When Baxandall posits a period eye, he also suggests a generic viewer, one who, he acknowledges, is a member of well-educated Italian elite circles, but who could be old or young, male or female, from northern Italy or southern Italy. Baxandall's synecdochic approach, though, is also an historical and historiographical phenomenon. It reflects both the particular qualities of 15th and 16th century Europe and the mentality of Baxandall's own 20th century visual environment. In other words, he was writing both as critical historian and as historical viewer himself. Across 3 volumes, Painting and Experience in 15th century Italy, Line with Sculptors of Renaissance Germany, and Shadows and Enlightenment, Baxandall probes the mentalities and assumptions with which early modern viewers approached their surrounding environment. But his vocabulary and approach changed sharply from Painting and Experience and Line with Sculptors to Shadows and Enlightenment. For the Line with Sculptors of 15th and 16th century Germany, he follows his method from Painting and Experience, explaining the period eye and then developing a contemporaneous vocabulary likely associated with that single eye and single glance. For 18th century Europe, however, Baxandall turns to the full opposite of the period eye. A single certain look becomes an inherently ambiguous shadow that changes and blurs from moment to moment. The shadow negates the synecdoche of the period eye, since it is simply not possible to comprehend the shadow's swift changes from a single glance. Knowledge of the shadow demands sequence, a series of glances and mental readjustments to understand its mutability. It is this shift from synecdoche to sequence that pervades Baxandall's shift in argument from Painting and Experience to Shadows and Enlightenment. In both volumes, Baxandall introduces his discussion of perception with line diagrams that could suggest either simultaneity or sequence, the diagrams that I'm showing here at left and right. Santo Brasco's plan of the Holy Sepulchre can evoke either a circle set into a rectangle or a progression from one shape to another as the eye moves inwards or outwards. Likewise, the drawing after Leonardo da Vinci of how light rays strike the human face can suggest either an entire moment of illumination or the process by which a light ray is bent when it strikes nose, mouth, or chin. In accord with the single look of the single period eye, Baxendale transforms the Holy Sepulchre into an instance of simultaneity. It is a group of lines combined into a single diagram that can then call to mind a variety of associations. Within the context of the mutable shadow, on the other hand, the drawing of the illuminated face becomes an inquiry into process. Baxendale extrapolates the single light rays into a narrative of how light and shadow will cascade across the face. The light ray is a starting point for considering how light falls and then is blocked by nose or chin. 2 centuries after the period eye, there is a new sequence of cause and effect. Implicit in the chronological scope associated with Baxendale's shift in terminology and in approach seems to be then an historical sea change. For the 15th and 16th century viewer, the unified look and notion of the period eye made sense. But for the 18th century viewer, a sequence of experiences that quickly succeeded but did not stand in for each other had become the primary mode of perception and comprehension. During the 17th century, that separates the period eye and shadows, the smoothness with which part stood in for whole quite literally came apart, in fact. Sequence replaced synecdoche. The rhetoric by which artists and architectural theorists alike describe their environment splintered into sequences of fragments. Numerous book title pages had been visual synecdoches in both senses, parts that stood in for the whole of the book's argument, and a unified design understood possibly simultaneously at a single glance. Michael Drayton's Polyolbion was a volume of English history, and the title page here at the left correspondingly contains a symmetrical, clearly organized diagrams of cues about English history. And all of these cues have been incorporated into a single arch. The title of the book placed where one would expect an inscription of an actual arch, and the position of the figures on the arch, indicating their role within the following text. At a glance, the reader can then extrapolate roughly the focus and structure of the subsequent narrative. The allegorical figure of England, even labeled on the title page, sits at the center of the arch, as she will be the focus of Drayton's text. Against the sides of the arch flanking her are figures in historical dress, evoking the different periods to be discussed by Drayton. They are part of the narrative since they are incorporated into the arch, yet the reader can also see their discreteness. For instance, here these upper figures are separated from the lower figures by the lit horizontal molding of each column capital. There are then both parts standing in for the whole argument, the figures who evoke stages in Drayton's narrative, and a whole visual composition, the symmetrical arch, that encourages a simultaneity of comprehension. This unity, so familiar to early modern readers, however, splinters into a sequence of layered and juxtaposed planes and pieces across the title page of John Smith's The General History of Virginia, shown here at the right. The title itself is no longer smoothly incorporated into a larger composition. Rather, it floats in an independent frame somewhere on top of the back plane. It stands at the center of the sheet, but otherwise has no connection to the map and the aerial view beneath it. Images, too, are superimposed on top of each other. For the portraits of Elizabeth I, James I, and the future Charles I likewise float on top of the map of England's North American colonies. These portraits interrupt and cover up parts of the map, for instance obscuring the heads of inlets, and so underscore their independence. That is, not only do their frames set them aside, but the connection of foreground to background appears to have been of little importance. Even the backplane itself cannot be understood with a single look. One is encouraged to look at top and then bottom or vice versa, since the page shifts from a diagrammatic two-dimensional map at the top to a three-dimensional bird's-eye perspective of topography at the bottom. From questions about distances from one place to another, or about the outline of the coastline, readers turn to questions about the lived experience of the colonies. Areas of light and shade appear with irregularly grouped clumps of trees. And 2 men stand in the foreground to evoke explicitly the contemporaneous Englishman's experience of the colonies. There is a clear boundary, moreover, that separates map and bird's-eye perspective, since the map ends above and the perspective begins below the 2 shields that flank the framed title. The title page of Smith's volume demands a sequence of looks. One looks only so far before one encounters a boundary: the frame of the title, the portrait frames, and the shields. And thus before one ends a particular moment of comprehension and starts another, adjusting one's questions visually and mentally. Sequence, moreover, was all around the 17th century body, not simply in books that could be opened and closed or even put to the side. The rhetoric with which architectural theorists discuss the built environment was beginning to showcase a series of moments of experience. Readers were well accustomed to plans like that of the Holy Sepulchre, which they could understand, at least to some degree, through a single glance. With a swift look across the plan of Andrea Palladio's Villa Valmarana, shown here at the left, one can understand the basic arrangement of rooms, that there is a central hall flanked by spaces increasingly smaller toward the back facade. Even basic measurements can be understood from this glance, since Palladio has noted the width and depth of some rooms. In his L'idea della architettura universale of 1615, Vincenzo Scamozzi began with this readily comprehensible plan. It is clear how the central rotunda space is surrounded by smaller rectangular rooms. Yet this ready comprehensibility is now simply a backdrop for lines that crisscross the plan, and that even challenge the plan's grid as they pass across rooms. In the text accompanying this illustration, Scamozzi in fact reveals that these lines depict the changeability of the villa's interior, how rooms will become illuminated when light rays pass through their windows. Implicitly, the lines showing these light rays represent different times of the day, and possibly of the year, collected onto a single plan. Light rays would not enter simultaneously from left and right, but would instead move across rooms from dawn to dusk and from winter to summer. The seeming unity of the plan has become deceptive. Scamozzi has transformed the unchanging grid of rooms into a framework that loosely holds together a sequence of moments occurring across time. Readers even must put their minds perpetually in motion, perpetually willing to readjust, simply to comprehend the illustration. For lines do not just indicate light rays, they also delineate the arc of light and shadow cast across a room, and so they are both the light itself and the effects of that light. For instance, these straight lines here are light rays, but this curve is an arc of light, and then you can see that this hatched area is an area where there would be shadow in the room. Readers must orient and reorient themselves as they move from one room to another in Scamozzi's plan, turning first to one and then another interpretation of his lines. The built environment, according to Scamozzi's treatise, was characterized by sequence, a series of experiences of the occupants of an interior, and a series of glances for the viewers of his illustration. Even were one to close Smith's volume and to forget Scamozzi's rhetoric of changeability, there was an inescapable reminder of the sequence underpinning daily life, the unrelenting ticking of the new pendulum clock from mid-century. Before Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock in 1657, there was already a well-established sense of the passage of time. Members of wealthy households could see the passage of time on clocks within the domestic interior, and there were also clocks on the exteriors of public buildings, such as churches and town halls. But this chronological narrative was comprehensible within short aural and visual moments that invited the equivalent of Baxendall's single look. Church and town hall clocks told out briefly the quarter hours, encapsulating in a brief span the far longer block of 15 minutes that had just passed. As the single hour hand passed around the clock face, moreover, it facilitated the single look of the period eye. Divisions on the clock face were in blocks of minutes, and thus the hand would move almost imperceptibly around the face. Viewers could look and look again, but it would make little difference. The clock face would still appear much the same. With the pendulum clock in 1657, however, and I'm showing you an example of this from the later 17th century, time and the perception of time became ongoing sequences that made a single listen and look accurate one moment and inaccurate the next. Clocks now ticked out the passage of minutes and seconds, with the addition of first a minute and then a second hand. One now heard a continuous series of moments, rather than a few moments isolated in silence. One too could see this continuous passage of time, since the new second hand moved through far smaller increments on the clock face than had the earlier single hour hand. 17th century viewers, moreover, had literally to look first one place and then another to read time accurately. Hour hand and minute hand were clearly connected to each other, clearly moving through the same sequence of time, since they were on the same face. The second hand, however, was on a separate and smaller face with its own independent numbering system, this smaller face that's right up here. Viewers thus had to read one clock face and then another, looking through the the outer and then at the inner ring of numbers, or vice versa, to tell time in its most precise detail. 2, there was an explicit reminder that the very human measurement of time, the means by which one comprehends the perception of passing daylight hours, was itself an ongoing process of negotiation and renegotiation. Owners used the 2 holes at the center of the clock, these 2 holes right here, to wind their clocks so that the clocks corresponded as closely as possible to natural time. At mid-century, scientists had discovered that noon could vary by a quarter hour from day to day, and clockmakers had then published tables for adjusting one's clock. Owners consulted the tables and altered their clocks with these winding holes. Time was far more explicitly passing and sequential than the hour hand and quarter-hour tolling of earlier clocks had suggested. One lived out ticking sequences in daily life, and those ticking sequences were even themselves thought and rethought. Within this context of a newly sequential environment, philosophers regrounded human perception, the very question that Baxandall investigated, in innate sequences of sensory observations and thoughts. Since antiquity, movement had been considered essential to human comprehension. Rhetorical theorists had urged readers to store ideas in imagined mental landscapes, through which they could walk to find their ideas again. But this movement was grounded in the assumption of mental processes that echoed Baxandall's period eye. One certainly walked through the landscape, but a single glance was enough to call to mind the next idea. One did not examine the particular space in detail, looking again and again. Rather, one used it as a quick mnemonic device, a device based on the assumption of simultaneous association between image and idea. In his essay concerning human understanding of 1690, John Locke claimed that one's thoughts could not thus be dependably stored in a single place and called swiftly to mind. Sensory observations and ideas alike, he asserted, were continuously moving in sequences through the mind when an individual was awake. One's very interaction with one's environment, in fact, occurred through this filter of motion. Humans, Locke asserted, perceived only those events that happened at the same pace as a sequence of observations and ideas passing through their minds. Events that happened too quickly would have begun and finished before one had finished perceiving their initial phases. An individual then would have had merely fragmentary knowledge of these events. Events that happened too slowly would still be continuing as the easily distracted mind turned to other observations. One would perceive an initial phase, and then unrelated observations would intervene so that later phases of the event would appear disconnected. Cause and effect, for instance, would seem detached from each other. Sequential motion, by the end of the 17th century, the earliest years of Baxandall's Shadows and Enlightenment, was so fully an accepted assumption about the relationship of the human body to its environment that motion had become characteristic of perception itself. The mutable shadow, then, Baxandall's paradigm for describing 18th century Europe, was symptomatic of the contemporaneous historical mentalities that he was investigating. Quite literally, in fact, shadows were connected to these mentalities by Locke himself, as he likened swiftly passing perceptions to the flitting of shadows over a cornfield. Perceptions, he claimed, may, quote, leave no more footsteps or remaining characters of themselves than shadows do flying over fields of corn, end quote. Human perceptions may pass through the mind with little effect, there one moment and gone the next, ephemeral and transitory, like the shadows of birds that one moment hide and then the next moment reveal bright sunlight. Scientists, too, are probing the mutability and even frangibility of the shadow. It was so far changeable that it could be dismembered, the Italian Francesco Maria Grimaldi observed in his 1665 treatise on light. When he used a thin plate to cast a shadow, streaks of various colors appeared within that shadow. Not only could the shadow be altered from its black or gray coloring, but it could be fractured so that it no longer replicated the object to which it corresponded. Shadows, by their very nature, according to 17th century theorists, by their inherent properties, and by the natural events that cause them, evoked swift change, and so a sequence of phases analogous to the perpetual progression of sensations and ideas through the human mind. Baxandall's turn from the period eye to shadows thus reflected the early modern collapse of a synecdochic mentality into sequential process. The simultaneity that had underpinned the Synecdochic period eye was no longer a viable means of comprehending the world, since both the human body and its surrounding environment stood still rarely, if at all. The single look of the period eye would register simply a blur of motion, and one could distinguish objects in that blur only if one too were in motion. The very approach by which Baxandall generated the period eye, his exploration of contemporaneous mentalities, undermined the possibility of any reuse of the period eye for 18th century Europe. Yet the shift from period eye to shadows was not merely the result of the historian's critical eye. Rather, as Baxandall wrote, he was himself a particular viewer of the 20th century world. He was self-consciously reflecting on his own visual environment. In both Painting and Experience and Shadows and Enlightenment, Baxandall interrupts his narrative to reflect on his historical material through a 20th century lens. And from this 20th century viewpoint, he suggests a version of the shift from synecdoche to sequence. In Painting and Experience, Baxandall closes his discussion of the period eye with a reminder that no matter how hard the historian tries, it is impossible to reconstruct the full range of associations with which 15th century Italian viewers comprehended their visual environment. But the historian can grasp at least some of what Baxandall terms his 15th century cognitive style. It is only, quote-unquote, eventually, that historians lose their accurate grasp, only as they progress farther and farther into the details of the early modern world. One must, in other words, be content with a synecdoche, with a part that must stand in as a rough sketch of the whole. When Baxandall concludes Shadows and Enlightenment, however, he places process and sequence at the very heart of his inquiry. Simply by starting to study shadows, he claims, one initiates a process of change. Quote, "As soon as we are addressing shadow, we are liable to denature it," end quote. Like the 15th century cognitive style, the shadow remains unknowable. Yet it is unknowable far more swiftly, from the first moments of inquiry. Quote, "As soon as," end quote, "one investigates shadow, its nature changes, since it becomes a particular presence to be investigated, instead of an absence, a hole of blankness." By inquiring about shadows, one is perpetually in process, trying to reach an initial and relatively stable step from which to begin constructing an argument. In the preface of Shadows and Enlightenment, Baxandall even makes the connection of his immediate surroundings to his historical inquiry explicit, even implying that this connection provided the primary impetus behind his volume. He explains to his reader that, quote, "The book was written out of an interest in looking at shadows, but it is colored by being an offshoot of work in progress on problems of visual attention in 18th century thought, modern thought, and in the art of painting." First and foremost, Baxandall is curious about shadows. What causes them, and how do we perceive them? Secondarily, his book is connected to other research on links of painting to philosophy across the 18th and 20th centuries. Shadows and Enlightenment is quote-unquote colored, influenced by this research, rather than primarily driven by it. As Baxandall's subsequent pages reveal, he turns to 18th century philosophy and painting alongside recent scientific studies and his own experiences, moving back and forth between critical historian and current viewer. For instance, a passage from the Scottish Thomas Reid's An Inquiry into the Human Mind introduces a 2-page excursus in which Baxandall ponders how he perceives his daily environment. Baxandall uses Reid's assertion of immediate perception and comprehension of one's environment to ask whether we actively examine the shadows around us, and his response begins with his own surroundings. Quote, "I am writing this at a table with a wall each side of it, on a day of mixed sun and cloud," end quote. Baxandall is, in other words, a curious viewer who seeks to set his own experiences in an historical explanation, and the historian's critical eye offers Baxandall a means of comprehending that historical context. Underpinning Baxandall's shift from the period eye of 1972 to the shadows of 1995 was precisely this curious, contemporaneous viewer. As Baxandall was describing the single and synecdochic look of the period eye, architectural designers and theorists were experimenting with a simultaneity of perception suggestive of a single look across the built environment. 8 years before Baxandall published Painting and Experience, Robert Venturi had designed the Bonaventuri house that I'm showing you here for his mother, with an exterior that made the building's purpose evident at a mere glance. The entrance facade is the basic, familiar outline of a house that even children know to draw, the triangle set on top of a rectangle with a few windows. There are certainly anomalies in the facade that distinguish it from the usual house. A rectangle cut out of the center of the triangle, where one would expect to see a solid chimney, and a window that extends oddly down to the ground. But these details are isolated in an otherwise planar facade, and so are easily perceptible. One does not have to look again and then again to understand the house. In a single moment, rather than across a long passage of time, one can understand roughly what the building is about. A humorous and potentially ironic interpretation of home in the 20th century. And only 5 years after Baxendale published Painting and Experience, and 3 years before he would publish his other account of the period eye and limewood sculptures, Charles Jenks wrote The Language of Postmodern Architecture, where he explicitly advocated a synecdochic approach to the built environment. To reinsert meaning into the building, he claimed, it should become a sign, a three-dimensional cue that would quickly direct the viewer's mind to its purpose. Just as Baxendale had explained how the 15th century Italian viewer would comprehend the plan of the Holy Sepulchre, recalling various associations simultaneously, so Jenks was recommending that the building should become a similar catalyst to the viewer's thought. Ideally, one looked at familiar signs that swiftly and easily brought these associations to mind. A single look was sufficient. Jenks describes no extended observation, and one then knew. When Baxendale wrote Shadows and Enlightenment 23 years later, in the mid-1990s, however, Synecdoche was splintering into sequence. Visitors could understand the gist of the Bonaventure house from a single glance. But viewers of Lloyds of London, completed 9 years before the publication of Shadows and Enlightenment, have to look again and then again. For the building itself is in motion. The exterior is, in fact, comprised of sequences of events. Elevators, as shown here on the right, glide up and down the exterior to transport the building's occupants from one floor to another. And while these elevators move, one's observation of the building correspondingly changes. The elevators themselves are arranged in different patterns. More of an elevator shaft may appear above or below the elevator, and the numbers denoting the floors are more or less easily seen without or with the shadow of the elevator. 2, the volumes of the building resist swift and easy perception. There are basic rectangular volumes that set the building off from the street, the 2 tall towers. But these towers are hardly uniform, and instead change in form as one's eye scans across their surface. There's this large cylinder here at the corner, and then from that large cylinder you move to this collection of tubular pipes here. And then the very way in which these volumes are assembled, moreover, suggests phases of looking. One looks at one volume, then halts briefly at a void, and moves on to the next volume. Here, if you look at the cylinder, you have a small section of the cylinder, and then there's a void of air before you get to the next section. Or when you move between the cylinder and the tubular pipes, there's this dark sort of empty void of shadow here. So there is a carefully structured rhythm to one's looking at Lloyds of London, a sequence of experiences which one must assemble in order to understand the exterior. Carefully punctuated and structured sequences of experiences could become quite literally the full environment that enveloped the human body during these years surrounding Shadows and Enlightenment. While Lloyds of London had staged a process of looking on its facade, the slow house that I'm showing you here, envisioned by the American firm of Diller and Scofidio, enwraps viewers in an interior focused on phases of experience. The slow house is a smoothly curving volume that gradually opens from a narrow door at the entrance to a large picture window facing out toward the water surrounding Long Island. Its very form, that is, showcases changing movements of the natural world. For instance, trees being blown by the wind or waves in the water. And these trees and waves are only one in a series of experiences available to the viewer, for the window is also a television screen. 24 hours a day, a video camera attached to the side of the house, it's attached right here in this pier, records the changing sea view, and the owners of the house can then choose to play back one of these recordings. A cloudy and rainy day can suddenly transform into a sunny afternoon, and dark night can likewise become brilliant sunlight. These recorded scenes can even be projected in other rooms that do not include the picture window, across both the slow house and the family's house in New York City. Video recordings, then, create the lived equivalent of the Lloyd's exterior, since they alternate with actual surroundings. One sees first one view and then another. Just as it is not sufficient to look briefly at the Lloyd's facade with its moving elevators, so too, more than a single glance is necessary to comprehend the picture window, as well as the other windows onto which the recording was projected. Not only are there small changes in the details, for instance, the direction in which trees are being blown, But the scene can change dramatically into its opposite: darkness relinquished for brilliant sunshine, or dense urban fabric replaced with expansive water view. One has to look and look again as one is presented with a variety of views that changes quickly as the shadows investigated by Baxandall. Such sequences of experience were so fundamental to human interaction with the surrounding world that they should be built into the very materials and forms of buildings, the American architect Greg Lynn argued only 1 year after Baxandall published Shadows and Enlightenment. Lynn recommended blobs, malleable amoebas that change shape in a mere moment, as a new basis for design. Previous design, he had claimed, had occurred on a firm, carefully bounded foundation, the contrast between particular and general concerns. For instance, the opposition between site-specific requirements and broader theoretical principles. Blobs, however, unseat the predictability of this gap. They are inherently a, quote, sticky, viscous, mobile, end quote, substance that changes from one context to another, and so that can fill any gap, whatever its shape, covering over idiosyncratic discrepancies between an unusual site and more general tenets of desirable design. But, Lynn argues, blobs do not simply erase gaps to create a unified composition. Rather, they highlight the gap, calling the viewer's attention to this difficult moment through their irregular and unexpected shape. And blobs, as Lynn subsequently envisioned them, evoke precisely this startling disjuncture that prompts a visual and mental process of orientation and reorientation. The embryological house, which Lynn designed 6 years later for the Venice Biennale of 2002, for instance, fills the stark empty whiteness of the U.S. pavilion with undulating curves that hide and so smooth out the sharply perpendicular edge where wall and floor meet. But this smoothly undulating form also startles and disorients. Brilliant blue contrasts with white. The volume is large but appears barely to touch the floor, confusingly weighty and weightless at the same time, and the form itself hardly suggests a house. One is led first one way and then another by this object that blurs one expectation into another. For instance, the convex curve that suggests massiveness, but then becomes lost in impenetrable shadow at the base. 3 years later, Lynn used blobs to blur and question gaps within his own object. His Skin and Bones exhibit readily calls to mind familiar stone and brick walls, where mortar separates one block from another. In Lynn's wall, blocks are again laid in rows on top of each other. But these blocks are the amoeba-like blobs that drip down over the row below and so hide the mortar. That is, Lynn is erasing the gaps between one block and another, and in so doing, he highlights the original gap of the mortar. The curving edges of the blob catch the viewer's eye because of their unexpectedness. One must continuously reorient one's expectations across the object, both from one block to another and from title to object. Where, for instance, is the skeletal structure promised by the title of Skin and Bones? The simultaneity of the synecdoche, or even the illusion of that simultaneity, is contradicted by these phases of experience. The building resists comprehension in a single glance, and reveals itself only across a process of visual and mental questioning. These investigations of sequence by Baxandall, as well as by architects, moreover, are strands in a broad rethinking of human experience, a debate that stretches across disciplines and across media. Daily life itself, the cultural geography Ariane Apodrai claimed in 1990, is ever more characterized by the sequential process of perception, halting, and then ongoing perception. 20 years earlier, Michel Foucault had grounded an argument about human society in phases of motion, but they were phases that contributed to predictable social harmony and stability. That is, to comprehensibility with the visual and mental glance of the period eye. Across discipline and punish, Foucault had described the emergence of a docile body, a body so fully trained in expected phases of motion that it inescapably obeyed all laws. Structures of authority had even, he claimed, replaced the human soul. There was thus a swiftness, even a simultaneity, to social interactions. One needed to think only fleetingly about interactions with others, since one could swiftly recognize and dependably comprehend gestures and actions. For Apodrai, however, daily life contains phases of experience that force one to pause and rethink, comprehending one's environment across time. Global flows of media, people, and products produce startling juxtapositions with familiar daily objects and people. There are disjunctures, Apodrai asserts, between the global and the local that make the local unfamiliar. A garden outside a house window, for instance, might appear startlingly verdant after one sees news coverage of a desert on the computer or television. Eye and mind would be more likely to pause at the garden before turning to other objects. The garden that might once have been simply accepted, simply one element of the scene observed through the window. The disjunctures described by Apodori slow down the comprehension of one's surrounding environment. So that comprehension clearly contains a sequence of phases. One has to adjust and readjust, moving through distinct moments of thought so that there is no easy connection of part to whole, but rather a series of fragments, each of which needs to be investigated on its own. When Baxandall set forth first the period eye and then his inquiry into shadows, he was both a critical historian and himself a curious viewer of his time, a more recent counterpart to the early modern beholders whom he described. As an historian, he turned to the terms and to the questions that reflected the cultural mentalities which he probed. As a viewer of his own world, he explored the modes of thought that resonated particularly with his environment, investigating the shadow suggestive of sequential experience, alongside architectural inquiry into sequence within the built environment, and alongside sociological inquiry into the phase experiences created by globalization. The period eye, thus, is both a methodology that stretches across disciplines and a highly specific response to a particular intersection of historical, early modern, as well as modern, visual and theoretical environments. It is an historical lens and a moment of critical self-reflection, a synecdochic mentality that paradoxically was itself also a phase in a sequence analogous to Locke's series of observations, or to the shadows that were so mutable. Thank you. On or off? Should I leave it on? Okay. Okay.
I'm very interested by your idea about the move from the eye that's described in the early books to the shadows. But I'm slightly worried about how much you separate the two, and I'll talk about that in a second, but even more how you historicize the two.
Okay.
Because I suppose when I start thinking about, let's say, the 16th century, the image might not be the shadow, but the image that comes into my head for mutability would be the cloud, and would be various poetic descriptions of the way in which changes in the cloud make one think about changes in life. And so one thinks, well, actually, mutability, a phrase you used a lot, is a classic late 16th century preoccupation. And then, of course, you think, well, actually, it's an Anglo-Saxon preoccupation as well. So I have a worry about going from a sort of simultaneity in the 15th and 16th centuries to sort of sequence in the 17th and 18th. For me, that's a problem to make it map that directly. But I think also it reminds me of something that someone was saying yesterday about the descriptions in the limewood sculptures of looking at some of those altarpieces, and the idea that you actually, in a sense, you had to look at them through a morning while the light changed. So I suppose I want to respect what you've said about the idea of there being different ways of looking, but I want to feel that they're actually much more involved together and much less separable than maybe your presentation has suggested.
I didn't mean to separate one absolutely from the other. What I was trying to convey was that there's a shift in emphasis. I think there is definitely mutability in the 16th century. You can see it in printed books as well, that they can change from one edition to another. What I'm trying to say, though, is that motion becomes the dominant mode of perception in the 17th century. And I think the shift from the period eye that's monocular and static to the shadow reflects that shift in emphasis. So that it's not like flipping a light switch on and off. It's more like moving along a spectrum more is what I was suggesting. Yes?
I had a bit of a question / comment also about the historicizing of the shift you described. I think thinking of Synecdoche in the 18th century, I think there's a lot of that. Alexander Pope's essay on man, for example, Synecdoche is the master trove of that book. And there's quite a lot of discussion in moral philosophy of the microcosm. And then that's also, represented a lot too as a way of understanding the world.
And I think that the notion of the microcosm must be somewhat similar to the notion of synecdoche as a way of designing things, or a way of visualizing things. So, on the other hand, you might say that Pope's essay on man is not about transformation. It's it's very static. And then maybe you might say that that's also true in moral philosophy in general. And maybe that's the usefulness of the microcosm idea. Although I guess you'd want to look around further in natural philosophy to the microcosm idea.
I think my response is similar to what it was to Peter's question, that I think there are two different ways of thinking that continue to coexist alongside each other. But that microcosm, if you look at the broader sort of picture of social history, political history, stands within a much stronger emphasis on travel and on motion. If you think about the wars that are occurring in the 18th century, that they're increasingly occurring across different colonial territories, so it's much more of a global world. Or if you think that there's increasing travel across Europe as well. So that I think that synecdoche and the microcosm you're talking about continue on, but it's within this context that is much more emphasis on sequences of experience. And you can see that also, I think, in philosophers as well. That someone like Descartes in the 17th century talks about the fact that you can no longer have syllogism where you move from A to B to C to D. That instead, what you need is a continuous sweep through the human mind in order to comprehend the world. That the mind needs to stay constantly in motion. You can't balance two opposites or two different parts of a statement.
No, there may be a change of emphasis, but I'm not sure how you will document that in a convincing way.
The way I think you document it in a convincing way is by looking at philosophical accounts. That someone like Descartes, as I was saying, who rejects the notion of syllogisms, who turns from this idea of contradiction, pairing, or analogy to the movement of the human mind, or to Locke, who talks about the human mind being in motion innately. That's a new discussion. Yes?
Montaigne?
Mind
in motion constantly, surely.
But it's not this.
I don't portray being, I portray passing.
That seems different to me than what Locke is saying, that everything is based on motion, that all human knowledge is based on motion. Yes, Alex?
I think you interesting for a very suggestive analysis. I think the introduction of the word period eye confuses things, because I think that, to put it very straightforwardly, you could say period eye in the Renaissance. Just to take your argument, I would cite the argument, but if I took your argument straightforwardly, you could say there was a period eye in the Renaissance which involved a bundle of visual competences in which you would include the synecdoche. I think you could equally well say for the 18th century that there was a similar period eye, among whose sort of practices was this fascination with shadows and the transitory and so on and so forth. So I think that the sort of period eye versus shadows doesn't quite work, because I think you can use the word period eye to encompass both. But that comes to another point. It seems to me that you're moving much more in the direction of Geistesgeschichte than period eye. And it struck me all the time when you were talking about these two contrasting modes of viewing. It's almost exactly the same as Wolfgang's distinction between the Renaissance and the Baroque. It's that kind of a stylistic distinction that you're making and a mode of viewing. And I think that's a different way of conceptualizing a mode of viewing than Michael Baxandall's conceptualizing of a mode of viewing, because he very much wants to relate it to a set of concrete practices in a culture. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with your analysis, and I thought it was quite a suggestive point as to how Michael Baxandall's preoccupations slightly shifted in relation to shifting preoccupations within the culture he was working. That was, I thought, very compelling. But I think that your implication of the period eye actually confuses the argument, that you're making a very different kind of argument.
Okay, I have two responses to the two different questions, and then one is my point is that Baxandall chooses to shift. We're choosing to use a period eye for the 18th century. Baxandall's choice was to use shadows. And he never transfers that period eye language to the 18th century.
He's not talking about the 18th century and shadows in the same way. I think it's a different kind of study.
I agree, it's a different...
He's not making claims that shadows is a study in the 18th century period eye. He's doing a different... I think you're right. He's doing a different kind of study. But I don't think he's laying claim to providing an account of an 18th century period eye.
No, and I think part of what the difference in the account is this difference in the mentality that the material itself is not as much of a cultural mind, as it's still the cultural mindset, but that it's not this more sort of static viewing. The second response to what you're talking about with Wolflin and the stylistic shift, yes, I agree that what I'm saying is very much like his opposition between open and closed form, for instance. But what I think is that I'm following Baxandall's strand and setting that within a cultural analysis. With Wolflin is more of a formal analysis. I have stylistic analysis by looking at the architecture as well as the art, but I'm setting it in the philosophical context as well as alongside pendulum clocks, which probably would not have been in a Wolflinian narrative. Yes, in the back. Sorry.
I just wondered what would happen if you chose different modern architectural examples and let those work back. Ones that resisted both sequence and synecdoche. The examples I would have in mind are Adolf Loos's Haus Müller or Terragni's Casa del Fascio. In the case of the latter, you can't read one facade from the other. You can't sequence from the facade to the interior. In the case of Haus Müller, you can't read the interior from the exterior, and the operation of the round plan creates, as it were, an indifferent relation between interiors and exteriors. So neither synecdoche nor sequence, except in the most literal sense, could explain it. And so therefore, if you took that as the model rather than the Greg Lynn and the Diller video, and ran that backwards, what would be interesting is that it would open up the possibility, using this as a model, that one could see things that the period eye could not have seen. And that therefore what becomes interesting would be the possibility of redrawing interiors. And Peter Eisman's done this with Bramante, for example, in order to show possibilities that could not have been seen at the time. And so the period eye becomes undone by a retroactive movement of using models that could not have been thought at the time to release potentialities that were not there. So I think it's interesting that you take Greg Lynn, who's all about a sequential algorithm that gives you smoothness, and therefore a version of sequence. And Dillon's video, again, it's algorithmic, and so you get sequence. But the modernist moment of Loos and Terragni would give you a completely different story that would, as it were, undo the unity of the period eye.
That modernist sequence, though, occurs before World War II, which is a major breaking moment in modern architectural design and theory. And Baxandall is writing in the post-war moment. He's writing as there is a turn towards monumentality, towards the idea of the building being experienced, generating a particular spirit for a community, or a particular reaction from the individual. So that he's writing on the other side of sort of a divide that occurs. And I was looking at the Bonaventure House and Lynn as being contemporaneous with Baxandall. So I think it's definitely interesting to, as Eisenman does, to take these different techniques of formal analysis and see what it says about a building. But the question that I had in this paper was, what would be surrounding Baxandall and sort of circulating through the visual culture as he's writing these books? In other words, as he's reflecting on his own environment and thinking about its relationship to the early modern world.
Well, at this time, I'd just like to come back to your reading of Painting Experience. I think you could find some support for your view in a certain reading of Alberti's account of the Costruzione Legittima, where the centric ray is what provides veridical vision. But Alberti never kind of describes, he doesn't give an account of how the centric ray might move. It's a very fixed kind of a visual pyramid. However, I think with my reading of Painting Experience, like the accounts of dancing and the dance steps, that has to be a sequential experience. And I don't see the period eye as a single glance And I'm also reminded, this was just anecdotal, but I think it's either in episodes or the Getty interview. A very formative experience for Michael was taking Ludwig Heidenreich's seminar in Munich about the Palazzo Ducale in Urbino. And he says how they spent seminars working out on the basis of a fascinating document by a major domo about 1500, about how the court, it was the duties of the familiares and the servants. They spent time working out how people moved through the palace. So I feel that actually in painting experience there's already this sense that the period eye is a cumulative experience.
I agree it's cumulative, and I think that's definitely the case. That's definitely acknowledged in the text itself. I think in terms of how it's being described, that Baxendale is describing someone looking at the painting after that accumulation of experience has occurred. So that he's positing a viewer looking at a painting with this already backlog of knowledge. So that what is simultaneous is the calling forth of these memories and recollections. So they sort of pop up at the same time. They're not going to come in, say, like a film strip or something. They're going to come up together.
I think part of it too is that synecdoche is sort of part of a mode of argumentation. In other words, a part has to stand in for the whole as you're arguing the text, even if you want to talk about simultaneity. So I think these need to be teased apart too, that synecdoche isn't simply how one looks, it's the problem of how one argues about what one might see simultaneously. And so I think part of what he's grappling with there is how to find a way of writing a mode of argumentation that can encompass simultaneity.
I agree, and I think that's what I was saying in the introduction when I said that he talks about the period eye in terms of a narrative argument, that he talks about one idea and then another, but he also qualifies it with that warning that even though he's talking about it in terms of a narrative, he still sees it as simultaneous. So he's acknowledging that disjunction between visual looking and then reading about that visual looking.